Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the, I believe, fourth session of the Nāgārjuna reading group. And before we start, you might notice that I have a virtual mask on. The reason for that, just to give us a really small reason if you're interested or if you were curious, I had a session of laser hair removal yesterday, and my skin gets like very reactive to that process. It gets very bumpy and swollen, and it just looks weird. So I'm using a virtual mask to cover that. Anyway, so let's proceed. So this time around, we actually decided to read multiple chapters. And that was great because these are very readable and sort of relatively short. And so we read chapter 3, 4, and 5, an analysis on the Āyatanas, the Skandhas, and the Dhātus. So I guess like last time, we can maybe make some general comments about these three different verses, and then maybe we can start to parse through the specific arguments in each chapter. So does anyone want to start? Sagar, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you've outlined these chapters that we've read.
Sure, yeah. So the first chapter, because it deals with the sense faculties and sense fields, so that is like vision and the visible, hearing and the audible, and so on, focuses pretty much the whole chapter on this argument that the sense faculties the sense faculties are defined via their capacity to access some kind of sense field, but because they themselves aren't part of their own sense field, they cannot have this capacity. And thus, since they're defined via this capacity, that is to access objects in some sense field, and they can't, they don't exist. And so this argument is operated on using this principle that things which are ultimately real do not operate in this reflexive way. And so this is why, for example, in the objection where something is given as an example of something that does operate in a reflexive way, the answer, the reply is that, well, that's not actually an ultimately real thing. The implicit objection being, for example, that fire is an example of something that operates in a reflexive way, that fire, burns, is itself burning and also can burn other things. But the reply, at least as informed by the commentaries, is that, but fire is not ultimately real, so it doesn't burn anything, so it's not clear how you could say that it is both burning and burns other things. So the principle that Nāgārjuna seems to be operating on, with which to proceed through this chapter, is to say that ultimately real things can't operate in a reflexive way, but ultimately real vision would need to operate in a reflexive way. And this argument is then generalized to the other sense faculties. And because the sense fields are simply defined as that which is accessed by the sense faculties, if the sense faculties don't exist, the sense fields don't either.
Right, and in this little chart I put up, the sense fields can be, is equivalent to what I have as the 6 sense objects. Could you confirm that?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, cool.
The things which are accessed by the faculties.
Right, so Vishaya Dhātu. Yeah, and so this principle you've been referring to is called the principle of irreflexivity, right? So the idea that something cannot operate on itself. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting principle that Alan Watts likes to bring up a lot in a lot of his talks. Interesting enough. Cool. So that's the analysis of the Āyatanas. What about the analysis of the Skandhas? And I feel like this one is sort of mostly based on an analysis of cause and effect, and the relationship between the skandhas, or particularly with the example of rupa, and showing how rupa as an effect of its causes, the causes of rupa, which are referred to in the text as the elements, as the various aspects of the Mahabhuta. And because neither the cause nor the effect exist inherently, they don't exist independently of each other. Can someone else say anything about the 5th chapter, the analysis of Dhātus, which sort of goes over the relationship between the bearer of a property and the characteristic property of an entity and that relationship?
Right. So I agree with Sideritz and Katsura in thinking that this argument is fairly puzzling. I think that the commentorial tradition's way of understanding it. Well, maybe I'll read what the Bhaviveka and what Bhavya and Chandrakirti say about it as Sideritz describes it. The scent of jasmine first pervades the flower and then pervades what comes in contact with the flower. The principle to be inferred from this is that a property of something can come to pervade something else only if that first pervades the thing itself. So if in virtue of vision, visible things gain the property of being visible, then that can only happen if first vision is itself also visible. And I find this puzzling just because, like, it seems just like, maybe this is weird, but this just seems like an argument with more obvious like responses to it than pretty much all the other arguments that I think Nāgārjuna makes. I think all the other arguments that Nāgārjuna makes so far that I have seen are ones where you like one could think of plausible objections, but at least it feels like I had to think about it a little while. But immediately with this one, I could just think perhaps this principle does not apply to the sense faculties. It just does not generalize to them. And since there's no reason given for why this principle of a property of properties having to pervade both things, since there's no argument given for why that has to apply to the sense faculties, I guess it just seems like a dismissible argument interpreted in that way. But then I didn't exactly understand the alternative way that Sideritz and Katsura propose to understand it, which they say is not advanced by any commentator, but seems plausible to them, I presume, nonetheless. I didn't exactly understand this alternative way of understanding the argument. So maybe if people know where I am, right, where I'm talking about, it's
right. So now we're doing more of a specific rundown of the chapter. So we're on the 2nd verse of the analysis of the Āyatanas.
Yeah.
In no way does vision see itself. If vision does not see itself, how will it see what is other? So yeah, and you were going over the explanation given by Bhavika and Chandrakirti, right, about the relationship between one entity and a property that pervades it, and then the same property pervading what it comes into contact with. And I would agree that is like a kind of an interesting argument that I kind of also have to think on. I kind of accepted, or the second kind of explanation that Sudhir and Kasura provide kind of makes a little bit more sense to me, in the sense that,
Then maybe you can explain it to me because I don't get it.
or I can explain to you what I think it means. And so I think like if seeing was the intrinsic nature of vision, then for it to be an intrinsic nature, it can't see only in virtue of an object being seen, because otherwise it would be in a dependent relationship. But for it to be intrinsic, it should be able to see without there being anything for there to be seen, because that's just intrinsic nature. But it can't. But seeing does not make sense other than in a relationship of seeing something else. So that's why seeing can't really see itself, because seeing is a relation, is a relational matter, and not something that something has intrinsically. Maybe I'm not really getting to what this argument means.
I think I understand. So basically, if vision only, if vision is only present when there are visible objects, then it would seem that vision's capacity to see is not vision's capacity to see is not something that's really, I guess, intrinsic to vision, but rather is. But this doesn't. Then this just seems like this would just collapse to. It seems the Abhidharmika could then say, okay, sure, then seeing is the svabhava of vision. It's just a svabhava, while vision is a dependently originated object, dependently originated upon, like via causality, upon a visible object, because Abhidharmikas believe that causally produced things can still have svabhavas. So then it would just seem that this argument just collapses into the causality argument, right? Does that make sense? Because if the argument is just that vision appears, since vision does not see itself, vision is dependent on visible objects, it seems that this is only a problem to the Abhidharmika if we already agree with Nāgārjuna in thinking that causal dependence precludes svabhava, which means that this argument, I guess, doesn't seem like its own argument anymore. Does that make sense?
Well, part of how I also understand it, which I was going to sort of elaborate a little bit, was just a sense that because seeing is this relationship of seer seeing something being seen, vision can't see itself, because otherwise the subject would have to render itself as an object, at which point it's not really the subject, right? So there can't be a subject to subject relationship without the subject turning itself into an object. So even something that, if you say that vision sees itself, maybe it sees itself in a kind of sequential sense in which it sees itself, it refers back to a previous instance of itself as like a representation of itself, but that's not true reflexivity, right? That's just recollection. So that's one way I understand that, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by the argument collapsing into an argument against causality. Can you elaborate on that?
As I understand it, the argument is, at least in this second interpretation, is vision doesn't manifest independently of other things, because if it did, then it could see itself. And the reason why that's true is if it could manifest seeing independent of any other thing, then the only thing available to see would be itself, because there's nothing else there except itself. That's what being independently having the property means. But since it can't do that, it clearly is not manifest independently of other things. And that's the argument. And I feel like the Abhidharmaka will just say, yes, that is true. Vision does not manifest independently of other things. Vision arises subsequently and caused by the visible object. Or, well, oh, but actually the Abhidharmaka wouldn't say that, because that's true for visual consciousness. But the sense faculty vision is generally not taken to arise in dependence upon visible objects. Right? Because the sense faculty is just like the eye, which doesn't need visual objects to exist.
Right, or just the organs,
Yeah.
So it's like a capacity
Right.
rather than like a thing itself.
Oh.
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the really basic metaphors kind of like do illustrate the point in like a interesting way to me. Like, the idea of a knife that can't cut itself or a finger that can't point back on itself. Is these are faculties, and I think the nature of a faculty is to sort of operate right outside of itself. So it doesn't sort of make sense how a faculty can operate on itself if it's necessarily something which operates on something else. So because it operates on something else, it's a dependent relation. But because it can't operate on itself, it doesn't exist independently.
And because it doesn't exist independently, but it's taken to be a faculty, it really can't be a faculty, because it's one thing to say that, say, a sense consciousness exists dependently on the actual thing that is cognized, right? It's one thing to say that a particular sight depends on a seeable object. But to say that the very faculty of vision depends on visible objects kind of seems to be saying that there isn't really such a faculty, because now it's not clear what differentiates the eyes from a particular act of seeing.
Oh.
Because before, in the Abhidharma picture, as I understand it, you have a sense object, let's say, this water bottle, it's a visible object, and it's made out of, it's made out of the four or whatever elements or whatever, but it's made out of material stuff. It's this water bottle. And there's a sense faculty, the eye, and with the eye as a supporting condition, this visible object causes the seer, the one who possesses that condition of the eye, to have a visual cognition, a chakshur vijnana. But now, if this faculty of the eye seems to have its very essential characteristic independence on visible objects like the water bottle, then how can it be the condition for the water bottle's efficacy in creating a visual cognition?
Oh, that's interesting.
Is where my mind is going with this now that I think I kind of get this argument.
I mean, part of what's going to be like, entailed progressively in these verses, right, is that because there's no faculty of vision, there's also correspondingly no process of seeing, nor no object of that's being seen either. So all three limbs of this, of what constitutes this relationship of seeing, don't ultimately exist. And I want to mention a little bit about how what's really interesting is that Nāgārjuna is using this sort of analysis of this basic structure that he can generalize to all the different sense faculties and sense spheres, the 12 Āyatanas. And it's this analysis of how any of these sense relationships can be broken down into basically a subject, an action, and an object. and how none of these three different things exist independently of the others. So they all exist in a dependence relationship. And because of that, the whole relation itself does not ultimately exist. And I just wanted to mention that to just sort of extract this sort of underlying structure to how he's analyzing sight in particular in these verses, which then generalizes to all the other senses because he's, because this basic structure is generalizable to all the different senses. Is there anything else that we can focus on for this chapter on the Āyatanas? Oh, there is this really important part, I think, towards the end, yeah, which sort of relates to how the Āyatanas, this analysis of the Āyatanas actually has consequences for how we understand the 12 Nidanas, or the chain of dependent origination. Because in verse 7, we have, due to the non-existence of vision and what is to be seen, the four, which are consciousness, contact, feeling, and desire, and so on, do not exist. How then will appropriation and so on come to be? So Siddhartha and Katsura elaborates that the argument is that in the absence of vision, there cannot be, with respect to all visual experience, the sense of ownership that is relevant to the origination of suffering. And so I thought that was interesting. Does anyone have comments on that?
So this kind of reminds me of something that I've been thinking about lately, which is that in Madhyamaka, it might be said that the notion of reversing the chain of dependent origination can almost be thought of as reversing it by realizing that it wasn't there to have its particular direction in the first place.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
reason why I've been thinking about this is because I've been thinking if Madhyamaka could provide resources for settling a particular doctrinal debate in Buddhism that originates in the Abhidharma period, which concerns whether it's possible that there's this one sutra in the Agamas where the Buddha, it's in the Nikayas too, it's paralleled, where the Buddha discusses how there's like an underlying tendency towards virtue or non-virtue that people may have. And it's from this that doing particular virtuous things comes from. And that he mentions the possibility of someone who has this root of virtue severed. And there's a question there's a question that basically was debated in Abhidharma times about whether such a person whose kushala mula, their root of virtue, is severed, whether they can get it back, or whether they are, to quote Buddhaghosa, who thought that they couldn't get it back, are just food for the fire of lower and lower hells. Because Buddhaghosa thought that such people, having lost their root of virtue, will simply never be inclined towards virtue again, and thus will just karmically descend and get stuck in a non-virtue trap. And I have been thinking about whether Madhyamaka could provide resources for settling this debate on the other side, and saying that it is possible, I suppose, or that this kind of trap of losing one's ability to morally improve is possible or not. I was thinking that maybe this notion in Madhyamaka that it's not really about reversing some ultimately real chain of dependent origination, but rather about seeing the unreality of dependently arisen things that could perhaps provide an avenue for refuting this possibility of a person who is beyond moral improvement. So that's what this kind of reminded me of, though I'm not sure 100% where to go with this connection.
Well, that's a really interesting connection to me, actually. That's pretty interesting. Um, I think from a Madhyamaka point of view, one thing I think about is, if virtue doesn't inherently exist, it neither increases nor decreases in any sort of way whatsoever. So the idea that someone could have this under this absolute minimum threshold that would make it possible to actually climb the ladders of virtue, the idea that that wouldn't be possible doesn't sound like it makes sense. Um, and neither does the sort of opposite case of that at some point there is this gradual accumulation of virtue or meritorious conduct that then gets you to Buddhahood. I think, yeah, I like this idea that the Madhyamaka insight might allow you not so much as progressively unravel the chain of dependent origination, but yeah, sort of like instantly get to the root, sort of immediately in some way. And I think that this sort of makes me think in general about this overall problem of the gradual versus immediate approach to paths to awakening. The idea of whether the path to awakening consists of progressive accumulation of merit and cultivation of qualities and unraveling of hindrances and fetters, or versus whether or not it's a immediate direct insight to something that's always accessible, or some combination of both. I don't know if that resolved any of your quandaries, but that was something that's what I responded with or thought of in response.
And it's interesting because this notion doesn't seem to actually even then necessarily be in conflict with the idea of reversing the 12-fold chain. Because if you look at what is said in the sutras about reversing, is it said with the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of the six sense bases. With the cessation of the six sense bases comes the cessation of blah, 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 until it goes backwards all the way to the cessation of ignorance. And then it says, such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. But this is just to say that when it says going in reverse, it means cutting these things off or relinquishing them in reverse. And seeing them as empty is a relinquishment. It can be seen as to see that something has not arisen or is non-arisen and is unreal is a cessation, in a sense, of that thing's power over you, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways I try to understand the 12 links of dependent origination, and I'm not sure how accurate this would be in according to the Buddhist tradition or how helpful, but I guess one way that I try to understand it is seeing how the causal series sort of exists in this sort of I don't know what you can call a logical virtual space, and or I mean, actually no, I got that reverse. So like the series might actually exist in a sort of I'm messing myself up here. Hold on. Okay, no, so I was right at first. No, so the causal series can be understood in a sort of logical sense and how they sort of relate to each other as conditions of each other in sort of this progressive sequence that sort of makes sense, how one follows from the other. But perhaps in actuality, all those things, all those processes, parts of the process of dependent origination exist in every actual moment. So this sort of helps me sort of gain an understanding of the relevance of the series in a progressive and regressive movement, but also seeing how this doesn't necessarily imply that, practically speaking, that there are these actual inherently existing links or steps that you go through one by one, but that more so it's a you sort of either get caught up in or relinquish the whole series moment to moment.
Yeah, I think I also tend to think of it that way, and part of why I think so is because if we really see it as starting with ignorance, things that arise in dependence on ignorance and with reference to ignorance only have their existence and power, I guess, in the realm of that ignorance. Does that make sense? Like if you are in a dream and you're taking the dream to not, if you're in a dream, maybe this isn't the best example, though it is a common one in Buddhist sutras. But if you're in a dream, all of the individual objects in that dream, all of their power over you, and all of your apprehension of them as real depends on your ignorance in that case. But it's not just the case that they follow like temporally your ignorance. They simply could not be there were it not for your ignorance, or their power over you simply could not be there. They only even have that power with reference to that ignorance. So it kind of
Right.
makes me think of like a vertical, like a pillar of the dependent origination where like ignorance is at the bottom and there's all these things up the pillar. And if you knock off the ignorance, the whole pillar falls down rather than like a chain of dominoes.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, yeah. No, I like how then we can think of ignorance coming first in both of those different ways, the sort of virtual and actual. So like virtually ignorance is sort of the first and the end of the series, right? It sort of is what causes all the other parts of the series to unfold, but it's also what ultimately results as like part of the process of unfolding of the other parts. Or from an actual point of view, ignorance is first in the sense that it's the all-pervasive element that's the condition of possibility for any of the other parts of this moment of samsara. So it's a matter of whether or not it's there or not that characterizes whether or not you're in samsara or not.
Today I was listening to a bit of a talk of a particular Rinpoche who recently published some writings on like meditation and stuff. And one of the things that he said was like that there's a very thin line between samsara and nirvana. And in truth, it is this thin line that if you really saw how thin it was, you could step over like it was nothing. But it seems like a great chasm in between.
Do you remember who that was?
Yeah, it was it was the Zurmang Rinpoche. It was Zurmang Karwang Rinpoche. And it was with reference to his recently published commentary on what is itself a concise commentary of the ninth Karmapa's Ocean of Definitive Meaning, which is a meditation. It's a really, really expansive meditation text that Bokar Rinpoche concisely put into a verse form for memorization. And then now the Zurmang Garwang Rinpoche has commented on that, and that commentary was recently published. And with reference to that, he was talking about this thin line that seems like a chasm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting imagery, just thinking about that line and, what are the sort of mental conditions or state of mind that makes you feel like it's this chasm, and what makes it feel like it's a line of infinitesimal width that's practically not even there. Cool. So let's move on to chapter 4, analysis of the Skandhas.
I would just like to mention one more thing before we go further.
Sure.
Because in this Slovene translation that I read yesterday, I saw this in one side note to this counter argument about fire. they say that they follow this interpretation of Sideritz and Katsura, also on which this Slovene translation is based, but they also say that there's another interpretation which can be found in Garfield, 1995, and Kalupahana, 1986. And the point of this counter-argument is a bit different. Just like the fire which burns everything except itself, also for the vision can be said that sees everything except itself. So vision and seeing are something separate, and vision is a substance in which seeing is present. And then they explain, because the core of Nāgārjuna's answer in both cases is similar, they finally decided for the third interpretation, because to them it seems that it makes more sense, considering the entire arguments and so on.
Sorry, so did you mention that Garfield had a different interpretation or different kind of response to the fire argument, right? Is that what you said? That your text points out that Garfield and Kalupahana have slightly different takes on the fire argument.
Yes, that
right.
That the point of the point of this argument is not that fire also burns itself, but just the opposite, that it burns everything else except itself.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like that, like, you know, you can't appeal to fire, the relationship between fire and what it burns, in order to sort of save something in the relationship of seeing, because burning also has the same inability to operate on itself. So the principle of irreflexivity also applies to fire as much as it applies to any of the sense faculties. Yeah, Mark.
Oh, did any of you have a understanding of the referring vision to the argument of the 3 times? Did you understand that in a simple way at all?
Which verses were that? Was that in particular?
Verse 3, the second half.
I see. Right. Yeah, and this refers back to the chapter on motion. It was the previous chapter. Yeah.
Did it make sense to you?
Well, I think to the extent that we consider vision not even just a faculty, like the faculty of vision, but also the precise moment in which the action of vision has been enacted, I think in that sense we can understand it in terms of the analysis of motion, because kind of like what I said with that last meeting is that when we were analyzing motion, what we're really analyzing was the nature of something and its changes in state, right? So motion is one kind of change in state. It's a sort of spatio-temporal change in state. I guess you can say the vision is a change of state from not seeing to seeing. And so whenever there's this change in state, there's this point at which it was not, that it is, and that it will be. So these are like the 3 times. And so, yeah, that's how I sort of understood its relationship to the analysis on motion. Because you can't find an act happening any of those 3 times. But I think it's actually useful to go over something that also I had a sort of issue with the argument of the 3 times. So I know that, so sort of referring back to the language of the previous chapter on going, just as the act of going is not found in the traversed and not yet traversed, or in what is presently being traversed. So the act of burning is not to be found in the burnt, the not yet burnt, or the presently burning. That was me reading from a quote from the Akutabaya. And so I guess that would also refer to seeing is not found in the seen, the not yet seen, and then what it is being seen. And so the act of seeing is not found in what has been seen, because what has been seen, past tense. So it's not in the act of seeing. So the act of seeing cannot be found in what's not seen yet, which is sort of self-explanatory. If it's not seen yet, so it can't be seen. Though the 3rd time, the present, can actually be a little tricky. So what is being presently seen is not being seen. And so the way I try to understand that is that what is presently being seen is presently being seen by virtue of it being something that's seen. So the idea that seeing happens in the present is incoherent in the sense that you're sort of circularly imposing the act of seeing in the present in order to explain seeing happening in the present. Does that make sense? Am I making sense there?
Could you say it again in another way?
Let me think on it. So seeing is not happening in the presently being seen, because then you have 2 seeings, right? You have the seeing that you're trying to ground, and then the seeing by virtue of in which the presently being seen is presently being seen, right? So
I see. The property duplication argument can work here as well.
okay, yeah, that's probably what I'm referring to. Yeah, Sagar, can you help me explain it? Because I feel like I'm just being repetitive.
Well, yeah. So it's like if something is seen, and you're saying that the seen is seen, then just as when you said the goer goes, you have a duplication. When you said the goer goes, there's 2, because there's the going, and there's also whatever going there is by which, like in virtue of which the goer is a goer. And here with the seen, you can say the same thing.
But can I just say, like, my cup? Sorry, I'm oversimplifying it maybe, but like, I'm seeing it presently, right? I don't really see the duplication. Like, it's happening now, and
Sorry, maybe I'm not. What is?
like, isn't the scene happening presently? I'm looking at my cup, the eye faculty, the object.
Right.
Isn't it just happening presently?
The argument is about.
I think, well, the argument was always about the locus of motion, right? So in this case, it would be the locus of seeing. Like, where is seeing happening?
Or, I mean, so it wasn't necessarily just with, it was also said it could be applied to the agent of motion as well, right? It can either be as, like, the present motion happens in the presently traversed space, which creates a duplication, or the present goer goes. So I wonder if that could also be applied even further than just those 2. But even if we apply with just those 2, I don't think the argument is about. I don't think that the argument is intended to say that because of this argument, the presently seen is not presently seen. I think it's meant to point out a problem with, as with other property-based arguments, which involve that Nāgārjuna makes, which involve properties like being a seer or being a goer or being presently traversed by motion, etc., I think is really meant to target our intuition of a world that is already carved up into objects and properties which characterize them, rather than really being like, I think the argument about the beginning, the unfindability of the beginning of motion, actually is maybe about motion or about events in time. But I think that these property arguments maybe are more about, like, this argument about like the presently traversed space and like these things maybe might be more about properties and objects than they are about actions and events. If that makes any sense.
Well, Mark, what do you think? Are you satisfied in any way in our discussion about the present state not having the locus of motion found or seeing or burning, depending on what we're talking about?
No, I'm sorry. I don't get it at all.
No, it's okay.
We
Well,
could just move on and I could go back to it in the discussion later.
well, there might be multiple different, multiple ways of understanding the same verse, and different arguments. So maybe it'll become clear later, or maybe my inability to explain also shows my lack of understanding as well. So, but yeah, we can, for the interest of time, we can move on to the analysis of the skandhas. So, like I had mentioned, this chapter takes particularly a sort of causal analysis of using the skandhas as a base of that analysis, in particular on focusing on rupa, the rupa skandha. And I have shared on my screen just this list of the various things that we're reading about the skandhas, the Āyatanas, and the Dhātus. And I wrote out the 5 aggregates, or the 5 skandhas, in their respective elemental colors that they're associated with. So just to let you know, these colors aren't arbitrary. Yeah, so we're focusing on rupa. And actually a quick comment I want to make before we get super into it, which is sort of tangentially related. It's a translation of rupa as either matter or form. And I have frequently come across this sort of, I don't know, like maybe controversy or contention over how to translate rupa in various contexts. And so a lot of people seem to have issues with translating it as form all the time. I know Bob Thurman likes to translate it as matter. And I've been starting to appreciate that a little bit more lately, particularly when we think that the form skandha, or the rupa skandha rather, is supposed to be causally originating from the 5 elements, the Mahabhuta, which is what's assumed in this chapter. So the translation of rupa as matter is interesting to me, and it feels like it makes more sense in form per se, which makes you also wonder about that formula, that reversible formula in the Heart Sutra and the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Rupa sunyata, sunyata rupa. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, or maybe matter is emptiness, emptiness is matter. And another reason why I kind of like this choice of the word matter is that it gives Madhyamikas the ability to, after we critique or critically engage with metaphysical materialism, let's say, we can still rehabilitate a kind of critical methodological materialism that still sees matter as empty and dependently originated, but still, consider it as matter, which is, not independent of its emptiness. That's just an interesting thing that I wanted to point out, because I'm always interested in seeing how, we can make use of Madhyamaka insight for a critical materialist analysis in the sort of form of critical theory or even Marxism. But that was sort of extended side note. Sorry. Cool. So let's start with the first verse. Rupa is not found separate from the cause of Rupa, nor is the cause of Rupa seen without Rupa. And in the commentary here, it explains that the cause of Rupa, like I said, are the 5 elements, or in particular here, because we're concerned with Rupa, is the 4 physical elements of fire, or earth, water, fire, and air. And in the commentary here, it's referred to in terms of atoms, sort of atomic elements. But I've also encountered other ways of looking at the 4 elements as these sort of four different kinds of, I guess you can say, qualities to all kinds of matter. So you have, I think, earth is like the principle of solidity, water is of fluidity, fire is sort of temperature, and air is like pressure, or sort of the force of attraction or repulsion. Just some side info if you're curious. Okay, so 2. If Rupa were separate from the cause of Rupa, then it would follow that Rupa is uncaused, but no object whatsoever is without any cause. And 3, moreover, if the cause of Rupa were separate from Rupa, the cause would be without effect, but there is no cause that is without effect. So I feel like these are kind of straightforward to understand. What do you guys think?
It's the same argument. I mean, they mentioned this, but it's the same reasoning as in the first chapter.
Right. Yeah, we were sort of back to a sort of analysis of causality here, but not necessarily just specific to causality as such, but also analyzing the sort of relationship between this particular relationship of production between these basic elements in material form.
Right. I like how Siddhartha and Katsura on the commentary on verse 4 make it explicit here then that the implication of this reasoning is that causality, for it to work, would involve things bearing this supposedly real causal relation to something unreal, but that's not possible. Because I think what this points to then is something that Siddhartha has written about extensively in other places, but doesn't explicitly say here, that the early Madhyamikas didn't believe in an ultimately real causal relation. And the reason why I think this is important is because I took a Buddhist philosophy class actually in school last semester. And when we read Nāgārjuna, we read Vigraha Vyavartani, we didn't read Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. And a lot of people in the class got the impression that Nāgārjuna's point was mainly to say that things stand in causal dependence relations to each other, and that this is the important insight. But that is something that Nāgārjuna thinks, but that's something that an Abhidharmika thinks as well.
Right.
The key thing is that Nāgārjuna thinks that this is true, and also that causality can't be a real relation. So all of these things then, which exist in dependence, like via causal dependence relations, because that's not a ultimately real relation, don't have ultimate reality. And this second part is dependent on this argumentative turn where you say, okay, but this relation, causality, doesn't make sense in the way that we take it to. Thus, all these things which we see as essentially participating in causal relations can't they have to have this essence imputed onto them and can't really be this way in a mind-independent way. The argumentative turn here relies on seeing causality as not a real relation that is, as Siddharth says here. And I think if you miss that, then it could seem unclear how Nāgārjuna's point is actually different from what an Abhidharmika says, which seemed to happen a great deal in that class.
Oh. Yeah, I think this vaguely reminds, kind of reminds me of one of the things I posted about on the group in response to something that Aditya said when we were discussing motion in the last session, about how you can go, so there seems to be like two major steps happening in a lot of what like Nāgārjuna is doing. So first you take, you sort of see this thing that's being posited or asserted as inherently existent, self-identical, self-subsisting, and you might analyze it into its constituent parts, its causal components, its relational components, its logical components, and sort of show how all these different elements are mutually, someone's trying to call me. So you can analyze this apparently self-existent whole into its constituent parts. Sorry, my mom keeps trying to call me right now. So you can take this self-existent whole, analyze it into its constituent parts, and because you can do that, and because you can point to how the different parts are don't exist inherently on their own, and only as in a relationship of mutual dependence, then that's why the self-existent whole isn't actually self-existently whole. But then, so I feel like a lot of times you can get stuck on that first step, that, okay, Nāgārjuna, instead of accepting the inherent existence of wholes and essences, is instead affirming this this more process-oriented view of mutual dependence, of interdependence. But maybe a second, more deeper step would be to show that because of the different parts that stand in dependent relationship with each other, sorry, I cannot think and talk and also get distracted by this phone. Do you see what I'm referring to? Sorry, maybe I was interrupted too many times to elaborate properly.
No, I think I do get what you're saying. It's like the Abhidharmika sees things as real and momentary and standing in causal relations to each other. And another perspective might be to see things as real, but reject that you can have separate things which stand in causal relation to each other, and thus believe in Satkaryavada, like in Shaivism or something, or in Sankhya. And then the Madhyamika takes this other position, which accepts the Abhidharma's premise, which accepts the Abhidharma's description of what's going on, but just relegates it to a conventional sphere by relegating this proposed relation, causality, to the conventional sphere. And thus neither has to affirm some kind of ultimately real transformative process, but also doesn't have to deny the ordinary, stuff that Buddhists think happen in the world, which is that impermanent things arise, give rise to other things, cease, etc.
Yeah, and I think maybe one point that I wasn't able to say because I got my head all got mixed up from the phone distraction, is that, yeah, rather than Nāgārjuna sort of denying the ontology of self-existent entities, doesn't necessarily also then affirm the existence or the ultimate existence of dependently originated entities. And that it's actually the dependently originated nature of these parts that actually undermine even their ultimate existence, not just the ultimate existence of whatever they are said to be a collection of. I think I'm getting closer to what my point was. It's like Nāgārjuna is not sort of making this reductive move, right? It's this from self-existent whole to relational causal parts. It's this much more radical move of seeing any kind of conceptualization of ontology as ultimately not real. Yeah, which also means that because Nāgārjuna, and I think this relates to what you're saying, you're mentioning, because Nāgārjuna is not denying one thing in opposition to another thing that he might affirm, he can actually accept, what parts of what he's critiquing on a convention level. You can still make use of a lot of what you found in Abhidharma, because it's not ultimately real, but in virtue of that, it's not non-existent either.
Right.
And I think this is what is referred to in the text, where Nāgārjuna points out that one can deny that Rupa has a cause without affirming that Rupa is causeless. If there are good reasons to deny both that Rupa has a cause and that Rupa is causeless, then perhaps we should affirm neither, and instead look for some hidden assumption that leads to the paradoxical situation. One possibility is the assumption that Rupa is ultimately real, something with intrinsic nature. And this reminds me a little bit about this concept of two forms of negation, the implicative and the non-implicative negation. And here would be an instance of a non-implicative negation, where Nāgārjuna's denial of Rupa having a cause is simply just that. It's a denial that has a cause. He's not denying it in virtue of his affirmation of it being causeless. Yeah, and so I think sort of just tying it back to your anecdote about your class, it might confuse you if you think that Nāgārjuna's sort of negative project is sort of implicative kind. If he's denying essences for dependently originated relations, but he's not doing that necessarily.
Yeah, I think in the class the problem was even more expansive than this, though. I think the problem was that people weren't seeing that Nāgārjuna's point is that these causal stories don't work if we take them to be involved. These causal stories don't work if we take them at face value, and was instead just saying that taking part in a causal story means that something doesn't have causally independent existence, which is trivially true and doesn't get, I guess, as deep as Nāgārjuna is going, which is to cast doubt on the ultimate possibility of these causal accounts in the very first place. But yeah, it definitely does seem, though, that like another easy mistake could be to go to the other extreme, and rather than seeing the thing that Nāgārjuna is negating as insufficiently expansive, which is what I think people in my class were doing. They weren't seeing that Nāgārjuna's negation is more expansive than as they thought. You could see it as too expansive, perhaps, and go as far as to make it an implicative negation, and thus say that rather than say that things are unreal and thus neither caused or uncaused, say that actually, because we've refuted this causal relation, that means that things are ultimately real and not caused ultimately.
Oh.
And both of those would be problems. One maintaining both of them would be problems in that they maintain the reality of the objects here. I think the ultimate reality of the objects in question. One of them does so by not even doing one of them does so by not even completing the negation. The other one does so by completing the negation, but then adding in an affirmation on top of it. When what you really want to do is just have one complete but non-implicative negation that negates the ultimate reality of things which take part in causal accounts without reaffirming their reality by giving some kind of uncausal account.
And this sort of almost sort of like absolutist extreme that you're referring to, so reminds me of some of the stuff that I get a sense from in East Asian Madhyamaka, maybe with stuff like from the Hawaiian school, where they have this emphasis on interdependence, as if the interdependence of all things was, as a totality, was almost a self-existent thing, right? As if like Indra's net, in spite of all the different parts being, reflections of all the others, and being this sort of manifold complex, there's still a sense in which the whole thing is self-existent. And I feel like that might happen if you end up sort of absolutizing dependent origination, and not seeing how dependent origination itself is also empty. Later on in the this chapter on the Skandhas, after Nāgārjuna states in the 7th verse that because we considered rupa to not exist inherently in this causal relationship, the same thing applies to all the other skandhas. And the commentary links to a remark that Chandrakirti puts or makes, which is that when the Madhyamaka seeks to prove the emptiness of one dharma, that of all dharmas is proven. And so that's a really interesting idea to me, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because it actually reminds me of something I came across in Shunu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, where there's a quote where he says, "When you understand one thing through and through, you understand everything." So, and I like this also in terms of sort of thinking about the relationship between the emptiness of a particular thing and the emptiness of all things. Are they identical or are they different? And it seems like it's emphasized throughout the traditions that, when you realize the emptiness of one thing, you also simultaneously, if you truly realize the emptiness of one thing, you simultaneously realize the emptiness of all things. And there's like an interesting way you can try to understand that relationship in either apophatic or cataphatic terms, or like negative versus positive terms. You can say either that the emptiness of a single thing is neither different nor identical to the emptiness of all things, in an apophatic sense, or from a cataphatic sense, you can say that the emptiness of all things is ascertained through the emptiness of a single thing, and that the emptiness of a single thing is ascertained through the emptiness of all things. Either way, which way you go, there's this interesting relationship in how the essence of one thing is also the essence of all things, which also reminds me of the Nāgārjuna quote, which is that all things have one nature, and that's no nature.
Right, which itself is a paraphrase of a quote from the Prajnaparamita Sutras.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's not in the Heart Sutra, but it's in one of the longer ones.
I see. Cool.
This is also kind of connected to how the Yogacara tradition conceives of what actually happens during Vipassana. Like Dharmakirti, for example, his account of Vipassana, of meditative insight, is that you basically gain, you like conceptually you have some conceptually constructed understanding of emptiness, which you then apply your samadhi to, and the application of this, basically inference of this quality or conception of this quality that is gained through having investigated particular things, when then concentrated on very deeply, produces a transformative experience, the experience of gaining insight, which actually is what eliminates the defilements. And I guess it's kind of like, I wouldn't know if it's exactly the same as saying like seeing the emptiness of one thing, because it's more like gaining this sort of intellectual understanding of emptiness and then meditating upon that in some sense, but it might be a related concept. I'm not entirely sure.
Well, there's an interesting elaboration of meditations on emptiness in Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Emptiness Yoga. And there he talks about something very similar to what you just said about this process of, yes, using trying to generate an inferential cognition of emptiness, is how he says it, through an analysis of a particular phenomena. Actually, usually the breath is the most like accessible, simple object to focus on. And once you acclimate yourself progressively to this emptiness, perhaps using some sort of basic reasonings, hopefully that sort of allows you to cease the conceptualization and allowing the inferential cognition of emptiness to then pass on to a non-conceptual direct perception of the emptiness of what's being analyzed. And then he talks about how, while it might be a somewhat of a gradual process of breaking through to the emptiness of that specific object being analyzed, once you go beyond the barrier and reach that non-conceptual direct perception of emptiness, then you can easily pervade this idea of emptiness to any subsequent object almost immediately. So you don't have to go back. So every object doesn't require this repetitive sequence of like analysis and deconstruction. But once you go through one, then the emptiness of anything else that you take into account starts to become apparent. And that's how you sort of increase it. And I think the suggestion was that at a certain finite amount of sufficient I guess you could say pervasions of this understanding, you just sort of move over to this more general understanding of the emptiness of all things. Like you don't actually have to enumerate all things as empty, which is impossible, but at a certain point, the quality pervades enough that it just becomes apparent that this quality pervades all things.
Should we go to the next chapter, maybe?
Sure. Actually, before we do that, I like the last paragraph of this chapter of that's the commentary. I think just an interesting thing to think about the Madhyamaka methodology. So here it says, Siddhartha and Katsura say that nowhere does Nāgārjuna give an argument that can be taken as a conclusive proof of emptiness. Instead, he refutes specific views of specific opponents who hold that there are non-empty things, things with intrinsic nature. His strategy thus depends on the opponent seeing that the strategy of a particular refutation may be applied to other cases. The opponent who, in the face of the refutation of the existence of rupa, simply pounds the table, insisting that the reality of feeling and so on shows that there are real skandhas, is failing to meet his obligation as a participant in a philosophical discussion. So I think there's like a lot of interesting things going on there about Madhyamaka methodology, maybe even what are the sufficient conditions for a Madhyamaka operation, let's say, we can say, can actually happen successfully, and perhaps even the limits of Madhyamaka. It seems like for Madhyamaka to operate properly and successfully, you need a receptive interlocutor, which is probably just goes without saying. But I just think that this emphasis is interesting, in that you need someone who's willing to sort of go with you along in this sort of pursuit of truth in this particular mode, in this sort of analytic mode. And I like how the commentary just points to how it sort of implies that if your interlocutor or opponent is just not on the same level, or is not following the rules of clear logical conduct, I guess, then perhaps you need some other means. And I think about more relational means that are based on how you relate to other people. And it's just something that it's just a point that's interesting to me about how powerful this Madhyamaka reasoning can be, but it's also like it's not an ultimate tool. Even as Madhyamakas, it's not the ultimate tool. It's one particular kind of tool that has a particular kind of use, particularly in a kind of analytic sphere. And at most, it's a sort of support for other things that we might do. That's more based on, like relations with other people and stuff like that. And sort of points to the dependent nature of Madhyamaka as well. So I like how Madhyamaka, in this sense, is not an exception to its own rule, right? So Madhyamaka teaches us that all things are empty, independently originated, which should apply to Madhyamaka as well. And the way to truly instantiate that is not to make the Madhyamaka out to be a kind of like set of, arguments that positively prove the truth of emptiness, that sort of can stand on its own, independent of any kind of particular context in which the arguments might be made. Actually, proper Madhyamaka analysis is always dependent on exactly what is being used as a resource provided by the opponent, and it sort of operates through that. Just an interesting point about how part of the consistency of Madhyamaka is not just a logical consistency, but a performative consistency too. You can't just use Madhyamaka properly in the sort of logical sense and in the way it reasons, but also perform it properly, deploy it in the way that it's meant to be. And I think this sort of relates generally, I think, to this controversy between Svatantrika and Prasangika Madhyamaka, the school of autonomous reasoning versus the school of dialectical consequence. What's the best way to approach Madhyamaka? And I think this text, and it seems clear to me in a lot of cases with Nāgārjuna, they more so depend on you making use of consequences to establish the falsity of the opponent's views. Does anyone have any kind of comment on that, or we can just move to the next chapter? Okay, so let's move to the next chapter. So that's the analysis of the Dhātus. And you can see on the screen that I'm sharing, the Dhātus are basically the 12 Āyatanas, including the 6 sense consciousnesses.
Though here he's not using this, he's using the list of 6 elements.
Oh, right. I totally missed that when I was writing this outline. Right. Yeah, there's so many different ways of translating that. Okay, so I guess forget what I said just there. And here in the Dhātus, yeah, it would be the 6 elements, the Mahabhuta, earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And okay, yeah, now it's coming back to me. So just like in the analysis of the Skandhas, how he was focusing particularly on Rupa and then generalizing that argument to all the other Skandhas. Same thing with the analysis of the Āyatanas, he focused on vision to then generalize to all the other sense faculties. Here, he is focusing on the Dhātu of space and analyzing that, and then later generalizing the analysis to all the other elements or the Dhātus. So what I found here is that if on the analysis of the Āyatanas, you have this sort of deconstruction of this relationship into the subject, object, and action relations. And in the analysis of Skandhas, you have this causal analysis, sort of deconstruction of production in terms of its cause and effect. Here in the analysis of Dhātus, you have this analysis of the relationship between an entity in terms of its defining characteristics. The entity as both a bearer of characteristics and the characteristics which bear upon the entity in question. And I think basically what he ends up saying is that because there can't be either characteristics without a bearer or a bearer without characteristics, then neither of them actually exist. But we can sort of unfold that as we go through the verses. So the first verse says, space does not at all exist prior to the defining characteristic of space. If it existed prior to its defining characteristic, it would follow that something exists without defining characteristic. Maybe we can go to the second one. Nowhere does there exist any such thing as an existent without defining characteristic. An existent devoid of defining characteristic being unreal, where would a defining characteristic function?
So here I like Siddhartha and Katsura, the argument they give in the commentary, that you can't have a bare particular with no defining characteristic, because even by saying this is some bare stuff lacking in defining characteristic, we're ascribing to it whatever characteristic makes it bare stuff, i.e. bare stuffness, and thus it actually does have a defining characteristic.
Right, the lack of characteristic is itself a characteristic that would have.
Or, well, I don't know if that's what it's saying, because if we thought that that was the case, if we thought that that was a legitimate argumentative strategy, then I feel like a lot of Nāgārjuna's arguments would be problematic too, because that seems to be just saying that this is an implicative absence. I think that what Siddhartha and Katsura are saying is bare particulars have bare particularness. If we didn't think so, then we wouldn't think that they are whatever it means to be a bare particular. And I don't know if they're necessarily attaching that as like some kind of negative characteristic where the characteristic is the absence of some other characteristic. Because I think
Oh, I see what you mean. Right.
because I think that a madhyamika would not want to admit that absences could be characteristics.
So it's more like saying, it's almost like saying a bear without characteristics is a bear without characteristics.
It's more like saying if you say bearer without characteristics, then take the second part off, right? That's a characterization you're giving, or rather, you're saying it's not the case that this bearer has characteristics. But then you would ask, okay, so what is it? And you say it's a bearer. At which point we seem to be, as Sidderit's saying, covertly attributing some defining characteristic to it. Whatever defining characteristic makes it a bearer.
I see.
I.e.,
Right.
which he calls bear stuffness.
Right. And that all happens implicitly, of course, in
Yeah.
our in the way in which we refer to it. Another way I kind of think about this as well is that isn't a particular in virtue of its defining characteristics? Without defining characteristics, you don't actually have a particular. So yeah, that's another way that it makes no sense to have a particular bearer with no defining characteristics. Yeah, and so they say that the idea of a characterless bearer is an actually incoherent notion. Verse 3, there is no functioning of the defining characteristic, whether the bearer is without defining characteristic or with defining characteristic. And it does not function anywhere other than where there is or is not a defining characteristic. So can I get help with that one?
I think the commentary is pretty helpful here. We already established before that it's not like there's a bearer which exists prior to the defining characteristic and then the defining characteristic inheres in some bearer. But then this verse is adding then, though, that the defining characteristic, it also can't be seen from the other side, that the defining characteristic is adding something here. Because if, let's say, we imagine there are two independent things which then operate, which then like have this inherent relation between one another. Either the bearer already has a defining characteristic independent of this defining characteristic which we are attributing to it, or it doesn't. We already established that it can't be the first one because we don't think there are bearer particulars. But that means that it has to already have a defining characteristic. But then if it already has a defining characteristic, it seems like we are doubling.
Right. Okay. Yeah, this is duplication issue. Yeah.
If we say that it exists prior to its defining characteristic, but think that it also can't exist without having a defining characteristic, then we either double or we end up in this infinite regress where we say space is characterized by non-resistance 1, but prior to that, it does still exist because it's characterized by non-resistance 2. But then we have to ask, okay, but it also exists prior to non-resistance 2, right? So what characterizes it then? And then we have to say non-resistance 3, and so on. And so in other words, if we think of the two as being able to have independent existence, then the relation between them of inherence seems to be useless. It doesn't seem to mean anything. If we think that the defining characteristic of the particular and the particular itself are at least theoretically independent entities, then the instantiation or the inherence, what they call the characterization relation, seems to have no function. I think is what I think that the commentary is saying their argument is, I think. And then 4 just is to say, okay, so since we've refuted a bearer of a defining characteristic, there's nothing to bear the defining characteristic, so then there's no defining characteristic either. So neither exists, but also there's nothing that has no defining characteristic, because if something had no defining characteristic, well, it wouldn't be what it is. So
This makes me think a little bit again about what I had mentioned earlier about this sort of deeper understanding of the consequences of dependence than what you might get stuck on at first, which is that like it's not just that bear and characteristic don't exist independently and that they exist dependently, but because they only exist in a relationship of mutual dependence, that actually undermines their inherent existence at all. So if there's no, yeah.
This is a pretty expansive argument then too, just like the causality one.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's sort of the similar relationship of like, because the relation can be broken down into these mutually dependent parts, that actually entails that the relationship itself is impossible. And so the thing itself is not constituted. I feel like, I guess like, and this is sort of me trying to like fix some of the misunderstandings I've had in the past, is that it's not this move from inherent existence to inherent non-existence, right? To inherent dependent existence, but rather the dependent relationship itself undermines the possibility of there being that entity.
Could you say that last part again?
So it's not that we're undermining the inherent existence of something in favor of inherent dependent existence or inherent dependently originated relationships, but that because the things that we're analyzing can be broken down into mutually dependent relational parts, and those things don't have inherent existence on their own, you don't actually have a relationship to be there. If the things are empty, independently originated, there are no things there to be in a relationship of dependence. You're using the first understanding of dependent. You're using the first relationship of dependent. You're emphasizing dependent existence first to undermine inherent existence. But then you also show that, or you also emphasize that because these things are dependently originated and not inherently existent, they don't even exist to be in a relationship of dependence in the first place. Does any of that make sense, or am I getting somewhere?
Yeah.
So this makes me want to, this chapter, I think the obvious objection to this chapter is trope theory. To say basically that that verse 4 is wrong. The verse 4, that is the second half of verse 4 CD. If a bearer of a defining characteristic does not hold, a defining characteristic is likewise impossible. I think that the opponent could say, no, actually, you can have an ontology with just properties, no bearers of the properties. This is actually, in fact, what Sautrantikas say, or at least it's close to it. The Sautrantika ontology, or at least the Sautrantika conception of dharmas in comparison to the Sarvastivadin one, which is what Nāgārjuna is dealing with here, actually, or at least in many places, seems to view dharmas merely as just properties which don't need to inhere in any bearer, but just are like, well, properties that don't have bearers, and the world is just made of properties. And this is in contemporary metaphysics called a trope ontology, where these properties which aren't inherent in anything are called tropes. And what's interesting about this objection is that Sideritz and Katsura don't bring it up, but Sideritz has actually written a very intriguing, I don't know if he came up with it, but Sideritz has written about a very intriguing potential response that the Madhyamika could make to the trope ontology, which is to raise the question of if you universally think that everything is just properties, that all there is to say that there is an occurrence of space is actually just an occurrence of non-resistance, the property, that there's not an easy way to square this from the fact that non-resistance as a characteristic seems to, in our experience, occur in many different loci. And that it's not easy to square all there being are just properties with this fact. And we might say, well, why? Couldn't we just say that you have like an occurrence of non-resistance here and an occurrence of solidity here, and then another occurrence of non-resistance here, and then another occurrence of, say, solidity here. And what distinguishes this occurrence of non-resistance from this one is that they're on opposite sides of this occurrence of solidity. But you can't really do that because that just pushes the question back. What differentiates this occurrence of solidity from this one? And you would have to do so with reference to another group of these properties, which then you would have to ask what individuates them, and so on. And so there's no way for tropes to individuate themselves, or it's hard to understand how tropes could individuate themselves, but nevertheless it seems like there's a multiplicity of tropes or of properties or instantiations of properties in the world. So it seems that, at least from Sideritz's perspective, the Madhyamika both has this path for refuting the ultimate reality of objects that are taken to stand in this inherence relation, either as the bearer of the property or as the property, but also has this pathway for refuting an object that's taken to be ultimately real and to stand in neither, and to not stand in this relation by simply just existing without being either a property or a bearer of properties, by saying that such things, if they were supposed to underlie our ordinary experience, wouldn't be able to be squared with our experience in seeming to instantiate properties in many different loci. And so if neither of these possibilities for how to explain the underlying ontology works, the place that we get then to is verse 6, that verse 6 and 7, that thus these things are neither existent nor not existent, nor bearers of defining characteristics, nor defining characteristics. Does that kind of make sense? I feel like this is important because when I read this chapter initially, I immediately thought, well, this just doesn't seem to actually apply at all to the Sautrantika ontology, because they don't even believe that, they just don't believe the premise of 4CD. They don't think that 4CD is true.
Well, can you elaborate a little bit on both the Sautrantika, maybe what the Sautrantika would say, or the modern trope theorist, on why exactly can there be properties without bearers?
Just to say that this bearer and defining characteristic differentiation is a mere conceptual distinction, and that instead an occurrence, to say that there's an occurrence of space, is simply to say an occurrence of non-resistance. It's not to say that there's an occurrence of something into which non-resistance inevitably adheres. Does that make sense? That's what the Sautrantika would say.
Let's see. Well, how would you differentiate these
In fact,
properties?
I actually have the Vasubandhu quote that's of relevance actually close at hand here. So let me very quickly get to it. Okay. So what he says is, only the non-being of a tangible thing is space. Therefore, where resistance is not found, one says space. So space is merely the occurrence of this non-resistance, rather than being some thing into which non-resistance is inhering. And what you asked was, well, how do they individuate these? And that's precisely what Sideritz thinks isn't possible.
I see, right.
Sideritz thinks that the problem here, or the problem that the Madhyamika could raise, is that on the one hand, if we think that on the one hand the idea of there being bearers and properties which inhere in those bearers doesn't make sense, because that implies some kind of bearer which exists prior to having a defining characteristic, which seems impossible. But on the other hand, having just one type of thing, which is just this occurrence of the defining characteristic without making reference to any bearer whatsoever, doesn't work, because there's no way to individuate different such occurrences. And that is I guess the expanded form of the argument that makes it resistant to the Sautrantika position.
And would you say that just very attempt to differentiate between these standalone properties or these tropes invariably lead you to at least even implicitly propose that there are bearers of these qualities or tropes?
I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that you could just be it's possible to just say that there are tropes and to not really examine the question of how they are individuated, and thus not really consider that there may be a definite need to introduce the notion of bearers.
I'm sort of asking, like, is it possible that by asking the question of how do you differentiate, it seems like you either say that you can't, or if you can, then you somehow invariably lead yourself back to to bearers.
I think that is what Sideritz thinks, or is what he's saying, is that any attempt to individuate them that is successful will have to sneak in bearers back in the back door, but this will just lead us back to exactly the same problems raised in chapter 5.
Right. Cool. And so Mark, go ahead.
Oh, you're good.
No, you can go ahead.
If I could play devil's advocate or Abhidharmika advocate, if somebody were to say, like, well, what if the bearer of the characteristic and the characteristic are the same thing? What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say precisely what I just described, which is that I would cross-question, okay, then how are two of these existents, which are just a collapsed single thing, neither bearer nor property, but rather just one thing, how are these to be differentiated from one another? So, for example, suppose we have three, okay, let's take a given, right? Let's say normally we're talking about earth atoms, right? And the Sarvastivadin thinks that an earth atom is like an atom, which is the bearer, into which solidity, which is the defining characteristic of earth atoms, according to the Abhidharma, is inhering. And then we have space atoms, and space has this defining characteristic. It's a bearer, and defining characteristic is non-resistance. And what you just proposed is, what if instead of saying an earth atom is a bearer with this property, we just said that there's only one thing? So let's say that that's true. Let's say that that's true of these atoms. They're just one thing. It's not a bearer and a property. And then let's say we have three earth atoms in a row, and we'll call them A, B, and C, and with a space in between each. And we'll call the spaces in between each space 1, that's the space between A and B, and space 2, the space between B and C. My question then would be, what makes space 1 distinct from space 2? Not asking how do we tell them apart, but literally what makes them two distinct things. Because if we collapse the bearer defining characteristic distinction, then all a space atom is simply an occurrence of non-resistance. So then I'm asking, what makes non-resistance 1 distinct from non-resistance 2? And the obvious answer seems to be, well, the first one is the one that's between A and B, while the second one is the one that's between B and C, so they're different ones. But this one presupposes that A, B, and C are distinct. And now we have to ask, well, then how did we differentiate A, B, and C? Because A, B, and C are just occurrences of solidity. So what is it that makes them distinct? Well, again, if we want, well, but now the obvious answer seems to be, well, what differentiates A, and what differentiates A and B from C is that A and B are next to 1, and what differentiates B and C from A is that it's next to 2, and what differentiates B from the other two is that it's next to both 1 and 2. But now we've just made reference again to the space things which we were trying to use the Earth atoms to differentiate. So we've gone in a circle, and so what the circle shows is that on this account, we haven't really found a way we haven't really grounded an explanation of what distinguishes different space atoms. And so, but nevertheless, we would want to say that space atoms are distinct. So this account isn't acceptable this account isn't acceptable either. And if none of the accounts are acceptable of how space atoms could ultimately exist, the Madhyamika comes to the position then that there's some fundamental presupposition that's mistaken in this whole process, that being that space atoms are ultimately real.
Are these arguments referring only to atoms?
I think this argument is applicable really broadly, actually. I think this argument is applicable to anything that is taken to stand in a... I actually don't really know what the limits of this argument are exactly. This argument, the argument about the Dhātus, because it's talking about the Mahabhutas, which are held to be, the things that underlie all material existence, I feel like this argument doesn't just have to apply to... This argument could apply to anything to which we are ascribing properties, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the Mahabhuta themselves are not always, like I mentioned earlier, they're not always understood in terms of discrete particular atoms. They're also just understood as qualities of different things. So you can think of them in terms of water atoms, or you can think of the property of viscosity, for example. Right. And I feel like as long as you have this relationship between this substratum that's the basis of a property, and then the defining characteristic that is the property, as long as we're concerned with this relationship, these sort of arguments will apply.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's an atom or a aspect in quality.
Because if you go with the atom picture, you'll run into the problems that are brought up in the chapter about having to believe in bare particulars. And if you go with the mere aspect picture, you run into the problem of individuation, of it being impossible to individuate them.
But what about if you took like a body of water, and I'm being devil's advocate, and I were to say, the characteristic and the bearer of the characteristic are the same thing? What would you say?
Well, that's exactly what we just went through, right? With this,
like the viscosity would be its characteristic, right? Or one of its characteristics.
Well, but you just said that you're collapsing the distinction between characteristic and bearer. So it's not the case that there's some characteristic-less body of water into which then viscosity is inhering. If we're collapsing, then all that's left is viscosity, an occurrence of viscosity. And that occurrence of viscosity, that picture where all we have is an occurrence of viscosity, is what I am saying it's not possible to individuate different occurrences of viscosity.
Okay.
Another kind of response that I sort of came up with in my head, and I'm not sure if it actually applies so it might not. But so thinking in terms of like a problematic thing that might arise from claiming that bear and property are actually identical. So let's take an example of an apple, right? So we can say that the apple bears the property of redness. If you think about like a red apple, we can also say that the apple bears the property of sweetness. So there's these two things, and we can even say that the apple bears the property of hardness to a certain extent. So if we're collapsing all of these, the distinction between bear and characteristic, then we're sort of saying that there are these different properties that both share the same bear, but are also identical to them. And so I think transitively, that almost implies that there's an identity between the various properties. So that's almost saying that the hardness and the sweetness and the redness are all also the same. But you can't have that because there is a distinction between bear and property. If you had no distinction between bear and property, then all the properties would be identical to each other as much as they are identical to the bears. So like an absurd conclusion like sort of arises from that.
So then to play Abhidharma advocate against that objection, what if the Abhidharmika said, okay, you're right, that if we really thought that all of these mere properties, solidity, redness, were in the exact same locus, then yes, we'd have to say that they're all actually identical with each other, and that's not okay. But what if what an apple actually is it's like a bunch of these solidity tropes right next to some redness tropes, which are right next to some sweetness tropes, and they're not actually really occupying the same locus, but that's just our conceptual fiction, is that they're occupying the same locus, and ultimately they're real and distinct, and we're just conflating them on accident. And that's how we get the idea of this object, apple.
Well, I would kind of think that if all of these different properties exist independently in their own locations, then that sort of begs the question as to what their interconnectedness is. Like, it sort of makes their collection arbitrary.
Yeah, and the Southronic would say, yes, it is arbitrary. There are no real apples, but there are real rednesses.
I see.
Is what I'm saying the Abhidharmika would say. Or the Southronic, I guess, in this case, would say there aren't really apples, and they're okay admitting that there aren't really apples, because this collecting is arbitrary, and it's just based on a mind collecting them arbitrarily, a sentient being doing that. But these tropes do actually exist, and they don't occupy the same locus, so we don't have to say they're identical.
Well, even the group of these very specific particular units of this unreal apple themselves sort of depend on the apple to differentiate them from other atoms that we're not including in the apple. So you, in a way, you're kind of still sneaking in the whole that is supposedly unreal in order to differentiate the particulars that are associated with that whole from other particulars which are not associated with the whole. So exactly. It's still circular. It's still,
yeah. Because at the point where, okay, you say there's no ultimately real apple, there's just a bunch of these rednesses and sweetnesses and so on next to each other, and you're imputing apple onto it. Well, you can then ask, okay, well, let's say then we have two things which would be conventionally called apples, but really are ultimately just collections of groups of rednesses and sweetnesses. What differentiates, if I point to one redness in one of the conventional apples, what makes it a different redness from this redness on the other apple? And you'll say, well, because it's next to these sweetnesses and not those sweetnesses. But then you've just brought back in the collection, which you agreed wasn't ultimately real. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's basically. Yeah, like even like you're still referring, you can't have these parts independently of the whole. You're still referring back to the whole in order to differentiate those parts as part of the whole.
Right. In order to say that they aren't identical with another redness
Right.
somewhere over here, or
Exactly.
another sweetness somewhere over here.
Exactly.
You guys are so sharp.
No.
Honestly, I feel like
I
half
did
this
send.
stuff- yeah.
I sent to the group chat Mark Sidoritz's explanation of this "you can't individuate tropes" argument. In the group chat, if that's helpful to anyone. I also, it's just the very thing which I tried explaining.
Oh, did you say you did, or are you going to?
No, I did. I sent it to the group chat that we made.
Oh, on Facebook. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me actually pull that up. Or actually, no, wait, I'm recording. Never mind. But I might put on the description of the video, actually.
Okay.
Cool. Cool. We're at almost at the last page of this chapter. I just want to go over some things that I underlined because I thought it was interesting. On the top of page 63, in the commentary by Sidoriz and Katsura, they say that to deny that space is existent is not to affirm that it is non-existent. And I just wanted to point out something, this repeated emphasis that the unreality of what we are analyzing does not entail its non-existence, because of the same reasons that entails its non-existence does not also entail its actual non-existence. Maybe I butchered that. The same reasoning that establishes something as not being existent also does not establish it as non-existent. Because in many of these cases, what we're actually dealing with are these incoherent conceptions or objects that actually can't exist or not exist. There's sort of these conceptual confusions that we may have when considering things as inherently existent.
And then it looks like the second half of verse 6 sort of addresses the entity that's understanding the existence and the non-existence, or problematizing the person that's understanding it. I think Chandrakirti really writes a lot about the word ka, the who, like who is the person that's going to understand existence or non-existence, but it's not really that well spelled out here.
Yeah, so verse 6 says, when the existent is not real, with respect to what will there come to be non-existent? Yeah, really to what I just explained. And existent and non-existent are contradictory properties. Who cognizes something, whether existent or non-existent? Yeah. I mean, part of what I get from that is that if you can't cognize something as existing, you can't cognize it as non-existing either. And this in general relates to this larger point that Sidoriz and Katsura are making in the following paragraph, where they say that, quote, opponents of Madhyamaka often claim that its doctrine of emptiness leads to the absurd result that nothing whatsoever exists, metaphysical nihilism. The argument of the present chapter has been that space is not ultimately real. If this argument can be generalized, then it would seem to lead to the conclusion that no supposed existent can be said to be ultimately real. The objection of metaphysical nihilism seems to be sustained, but metaphysical nihilism is a doctrine that all supposedly existing things are ultimately non-existent. If the argument of verse 6 is correct, can this be true? So yeah, so that's just reiterating the point that if the inherent existence of something is not possible because it's an incoherent notion produced by mental confusion, then the same thing can't be said to non-exist, because only something that makes coherent sense can exist or not exist. So yeah, so the Madhyamaka is final point is not that things ultimately don't exist, but rather is more something like the freedom from conceptualization in terms of existence, non-existence, both or neither as such. Yeah, and then verse 7 explains that the analysis of space applies to the analysis of the other elements, or the Dhātus. And then an interesting final verse here, quote, but those of little intellect who take there to be existence and non-existence with respect to things, they do not see the auspicious sensation of what is to be seen. So, yeah, if you're not convinced that things cannot be said to ultimately exist or not exist, then you won't stop reifying things. Says that as long as you're aiming to ground things in terms of existence or non-existence, and perhaps both and neither, you're invariably going to lead yourself to the problem of hypothesization, mistaking what's not ultimately real for being ultimately real. Cool. So do we have any more concluding remarks on these 3 chapters?
I just had a really, really basic remark about the skandhas. I always took the second skandha feeling, Vedana. I always took it to mean emotional feeling, but after relating it to Rupa, I get the sense it means like tactile feeling. Would that be right?
Actually, it's neither. It refers to just pure experiential valence. It means
Right.
like the Buddhist psychology basically holds that there is this thing called Vedana, which is a particular kind of valence of an experience, either positive, negative, or neutral. And that sometimes when a particular being is having an experience, it will be accompanied by a positive valence to that experience, a neutral one, or a negative one. And so this is, it's like a far more simple level of thing than in emotion, which is like a complex thing, but it's also not merely like tactile sensation. Tactile sensation is actually
Sparsha.
right, yeah, and in the body, like, which is considered to be made of rupa because it's like a sense object, I guess. Like,
Right.
Could you give like an example of it, Vedana feeling?
positive, negative, and neutral. Those are the 3 kinds. That's it.
I still don't really get it.
It's just, I feel like it's perhaps not identical to it, but it's related to a, I guess you could say, a value judgment on a affective register. So the sense, the feeling that something is positive and good, and the sense that it's negative and something to be averse to, or the sort of neutral sort of sense of indifference. Though I have read in certain places that in certain systems, neutrality is not necessarily included, because you can argue that what we call neutral are just incredibly minuscule magnitudes of positive or negative. So really there's only positive or negative, but traditionally in general it's and I think in the suttas in the Pali Canon too, it's characterized as positive, negative, and neutral. So the sense that, so when I eat an ice cream, the sense that it tastes good and I like it, it's the positive feeling there. Whereas the actual sensation, the sensory contact, yeah, that's and how it feels in my body, that's different. Actually, in case it's helpful a little bit, the relationship between the skandhas and the Dhātus. So the 5 physical sense objects and the 5 physical sense faculties are all included in rupa. So, that includes the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, organs and objects. And then feeling, perception, formation, or vedana, samjna, and or samnya and samskara, those are all included in the one mental sense object, which the one mental sense object of consciousness, and then vijnana, which is the consciousness skandha, that's composed of the mental sense organ and the all six sense consciousnesses. So that's just like the relationship between the different classifications. Yeah, anyone else have any final comments? Okay, well, let's figure out what to read for next week. Let's see. The next chapter is pretty short, it seems, an analysis of desire and the one who desires. And then 7 is an analysis of the conditioned. And that's about a little less than 30 pages. So what do you guys think about 6 and 7? Cool, let's do that. Doesn't seem like the ones we read aren't necessarily related either, but it was nice to read them in group, the Āyatanas, Skandhas, and Dhātus. But yeah, so I guess we can do 6 and 7 for next week. Does that sound good for everyone? Cool, okay. Thanks everyone. Very low turnout, but still very fun conversation and insightful. And I'm probably gonna edit out a little bit of that phone call disaster for easier listening for people. Cool, all right, thanks. See you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.